The world was malice, pure and white. The winter of 1886 had come to the Wyoming Territory not as a season, but as a judgment. It was the Great Die-Up, a name whispered by men who had seen their entire herds frozen upright. Statues of failure in the valleys around Bitter Willow. The wind had no obstacle. It blew from the north with a locomotive's force, carrying ice that didn't fall so much as it attacked horizontally. The temperature had plunged to 20 below zero, and then 30, and then the thermometers simply gave up, the mercury hiding at the bottom of the glass. Nora Vale, 28 years old, understood the judgment. She was being erased. Her husband, Jebediah Rusk, had delivered the verdict. The wagon axle, seasoned oak thick as a man's thigh, had surrendered with a sharp crack, like a rifle shot fired in a canyon. The sound was immediately stolen by the wind. The mule, tethered to the back, gave a high, thin bray. Jebediah, who had been riding his own horse ahead to break the drift, didn't even turn at the sound of the axle. He turned at her scream. He rode back, his face hidden by a scarf, only his eyes visible. They were flat, assessing. He looked at the shattered wheel. The wagon canted over, spilling their meager supplies into the snow. He looked at her. He looked at the path ahead. He made his calculation. He dismounted, but not to help her. He walked to the mule, pulled his knife, and cut it loose. Then he cut the traces on the wagon's horse. He was saving the animals. He slapped the wagon horse hard, sending it plunging riderless into the gray. He mounted his own horse, the mule's lead rope in his hand. "Jeb!" she screamed. "Jebediah!" He looked at her, right at her. He said nothing. He simply turned his horse west, toward the faint, theoretical line of Bitter Willow. Maybe it was 5 miles. Maybe it was an eternity. He left her. He left her with the broken skeleton of the wagon. A woman alone in a white hurricane. An offering to the storm. Nora didn't waste breath screaming again. She scrambled, crawling on hands and knees, back to the wagon box. She ignored the spilled sacks of flour, the coffee beans scattering like brown gravel. She dug for the leather satchel. Her fingers, inside thin woolen gloves that were now useless, fumbled with the clasp. She pulled it free and shoved it inside her coat, pressing it against her ribs. The leather was stiff, cold as iron. Her father's satchel, inside. The papers that proved her right to the land, the deeds, the notes of debt, and the map. The map was the treasure. Spring Knife Creek, a thin, wavering line of blue ink on calf skin, showing the shallow aquifer, the secret pulse of water that made her dry acres the most valuable land in the valley. Jebediah wanted to sell that secret, sell it to the railroad men for paper money and a ticket back east. She huddled behind the broken wheel, the wind slicing through her coat as if it were muslin. The cold was a physical weight. Her fingers went first. The aching stopped, replaced by a dull, wooden numbness. She tried to make a fist and could not. The cold was crawling up her wrists, into her arms. It was a slow, heavy sleep, and it felt almost peaceful. Hold the water, Nora. Hold the life. Her father's voice. It wasn't a memory, not just a sound. It was a feeling, like a small, hot coal placed in the center of her chest, the last ember of defiance. He'd stood with her on the dry ridge, his hand on her shoulder, the same satchel in his hand. They see dust, they see sage. But we know. They can take the grass, they can take the cattle, but the man who holds the water holds the life. Don't you ever let them take the water. She would not sleep. She would not let him win. The storm had a voice, a high, constant shriek, like metal tearing metal. But beneath it, a new sound. A percussion. Thump, thump, thump. Heavy, rhythmic, impossible. It was a heartbeat inside the storm. A shape resolved out of the gray. It was not a deer, not a wolf. It was a horse, massive as a buffalo, blowing clouds of steam. And on its back, a man who seemed part of the winter itself. Silas Calder Pike, 35 years old. The owner of Pike's Cut, the ranch that bordered hers. A man known for his silence. A man who lived with his cattle and his dogs and nothing else. His heavy canvas duster was a sheet of armor, ice layered thick upon it. It cracked and shattered like glass as he swung one leg over the saddle. He didn't sink. His boots were wrapped in burlap, giving him purchase. He moved toward her, his face dark with frost, his beard a mask of ice crystals. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask where Jebediah was. His eyes, the color of a winter sky before dawn, took in the broken wagon, the tracks of the two horses leading away, and her. Her face was the color of old wax, her lips a dark, frightening blue. He knelt in the drift, a solid wall of man that momentarily broke the wind. She saw him assess her, the way a rancher assesses a newborn calf found in the snow. His own gloves were thick mule hide, frozen stiff. He looked at them, looked at her face. With a grunt, he yanked his right glove off, baring his hand to the air that would freeze skin in minutes. The flesh was chapped, scarred, dark red. He didn't hesitate. He laid that bare, living hand flat against her cheek. The shock of it was violent. It was not a gentle touch. It was a branding, a raw, stinging transfer of heat. It hurt. It burned. And then, beneath the burn, it was life. It was the first thing she had truly felt in an hour. "I won't let you sleep here." His voice was a low rumble, rough as gravel. It was not a question. It was a command aimed at death itself. As he moved, sliding one arm under her knees, the other around her back, her head lolled, her eyes, slits against the ice, caught a flicker of movement, far down the path. A dark shape. Jebediah. He had stopped. He was looking back. He saw the new horse. He saw the towering shape of Silas Pike. He saw his wife being lifted. He watched for 3 seconds. Then, with a visible kick of his heels, he spurred his horse into a run, disappearing into the white. The hoofprints he left were sharp, a clean slice in the drift, a line drawn, a life cut away. Silas wasted no time. He was all economy of motion. He lifted her as if she were a child. He pulled a heavy, waxed canvas bedroll from behind his saddle, unrolled it with one hand, and wrapped her in it, tight as a burial shroud, but warm. He mounted his horse, a big roan, in one fluid movement, pulling her into the saddle in front of him, settling her against his chest. Her world collapsed to sensory data, the solid wall of his body, the smell of wet wool, horse, and the faint, clean odor of hay and tobacco that clung to his undershirt. He wrapped one massive arm around her, pinning the bedroll and her father's satchel to her chest. His arm was a steel bar. He took the reins and turned the horse, not west toward Bitter Willow, but north, into the heart of the storm, toward Pike's Cut. The ride was a timeless agony. The sky was a pressing, bruised ceiling. The horse, trusting its master, moved with a steady, plunging gait. Nora could feel the animal's muscles working beneath her. The only sound, other than the muffled rhythm of the hooves, was the screaming of the wind as it hit the wooden guideposts Silas had sunk along his fence line. They sang like taut wires, a high, lonely, vibrating keen that was the only music in the empty world. Nora buried her face in the rough, ice-crusted wool of his coat. She was too cold to shiver. She was a stone. A cold, miserable stone being carried by a mountain. She felt a trickle of water. It ran from her hairline, over her temple, past the corner of her eye. It was too warm to be snow, too slow to be rain. The snow, matted in her hair and eyebrows, packed against her skin by the force of the wind, was melting. It was the heat from his body, radiating through the wool, through the canvas, reaching her. It melted the ice. The water ran down her cheek, mixing with the salt of the tears that had frozen there hours ago, mixing with the salt of her own desperate sweat. It all tasted the same, salt water, the taste of the ocean, impossible in this high, dry, frozen land, the taste of a life she had been forced to leave, and the taste of one she had just, impossibly, been given. The horse stopped, its sides heaving, its breath pluming in the lee of a structure that was more bunker than cabin. The logs were thick, the gaps plugged tight with mud and straw. It was a place built to deny the wind. Silas dismounted, the frozen canvas bedroll cradling Nora still in his arms. He didn't bother with the door handle. He kicked the thick plank open with his booted heel and entered the single, dark room. A large, gray dog, a mix of shepherd and something wilder, lifted its head from a pile of gunny sacks, observed the intrusion, and then, recognizing its master, laid its head back down. He crossed the room in 3 strides and deposited her on the simple cot built into the wall. The bedroll was stiff, cracking like ice as he unbuckled the straps. His hands, bare and cherry red from the cold, worked quickly. He was all function, no ceremony. Stove, he muttered to himself. He moved to the corner, where a large cast-iron stove stood cold. He opened the firebox, stuffed it with dry pine shavings and split logs from the box beside it, and struck a single lucifer match against the iron. The flame caught with a hungry whoosh, the draw of the chimney pipe immediately pulling the smoke upward. A dull, orange light began to color the room. He turned back to her. The ice on her coat was beginning to melt in the rising warmth. "You'll catch your death if you stay in that," he said. His voice was flat. Nora tried to move her fingers, but they were useless wooden pegs. He knelt beside the cot. He didn't ask permission. He simply began to work on the frozen buttons of her coat, his thick, scarred knuckles brushing her chin. He pulled the sodden, heavy garment off her, ice shattering and skittering across the floorboards. He did the same with her boots, which were frozen solid to her stockings. He had to use his knife to cut the laces. He retrieved a tin cup, went to a wooden bucket by the door, and used the handle of the dipper to break the film of ice that had formed on the water's surface. He filled the kettle, hung it on a hook over the stove's heating plate, and dropped in a pinch of dried, gray-green leaves from a tin. Sage. The warmth began to reach her, and with it came the pain. It started in her fingers and toes, a deep, agonizing prickle, as if she were being stung by 1,000 hornets. Then came the shivering. It was not a gentle tremor. It was a violent, uncontrollable spasm that shook the wooden cot, rattling her teeth in her skull. It was the body's war to reclaim itself. Silas returned with the steaming tin cup. "Drink." He didn't try to help her hold it. He just held it out, steady, until her own shaking hands could grasp it. The tin was scorching, the heat a new sharp pain that cut through the numbness. She brought it to her lips and drank. The sage tea was bitter, herbal, and intensely hot. It scalded a path down her throat, hitting her stomach like a hot coal. Her legs were shaking so hard she kicked the wall. Silas watched her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He grabbed a rough burlap towel from a peg. He knelt at the foot of the cot. He didn't lift her dress, but reached beneath the hem, finding her shins, which were covered in thick, damp wool stockings. He wrapped the towel around one calf and began to rub. Hard. His hands were tools of leather and callous. They were hands that knew rope and wood and stone. He was not gentle. He was efficient. He scrubbed, the friction of the rough towel generating a fierce, dry heat, forcing the blood to move through the frozen tissues. He worked his way from her ankle to her knee, back and forth, a steady, powerful rhythm. He didn't look at her face. He kept his eyes on his hands, as if he were polishing a rifle stock or sharpening a blade. His concentration was absolute. He was a man sparing with his words, but his hands, in their harsh, methodical way, were speaking of survival. "He left me," Nora whispered. The words were torn from her, pushed out by the shivers. Silas paused, his hand still on her ankle. He looked up. His eyes were the color of gunmetal. "I saw. It was the paper. He wanted the water." His gaze sharpened. He stopped rubbing. "What water?" Her hand, still shaking but now able to move, went to the leather satchel inside her shirt. She pulled it free. Her fingers fumbled with the clasp. She pulled out the folded calfskin map first, her father's map, and handed it to him. He took it, standing to spread it on the small table by the stove. The firelight illuminated the thin, wavering blue line, Spring Knife Creek. "He brought a man from the railroad," she said, her voice gaining a desperate, thin strength. "He wanted me to sign. He had a paper." She fumbled again. this time in the pocket of her dress, and pulled out a damp, crumpled ball of paper. She held it out. Silas took it. He carefully unfolded it on the table. Next to the map, it was an option contract. The cheap ink had run, the blue loops and letters blurring into the fibers of the paper. It granted a 180-day option to a Mr. Thadley Rourke, representing the Northern Union Rail Company, to purchase all water rights pertaining to her homestead for the sum of $100. Silas read it twice. His expression didn't change, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. He looked at the bottom, at the smeared purple stamp from the Bitter Willow Territorial Office, a temporary seal, Amos Fletch, Magistrate. A low, quiet sound came from Silas's chest, just barely a grunt. He knew Amos Fletch. He knew the dishonest rot that clung to the man. This paper, combined with Jebediah's act of abandonment, was not just a domestic dispute. It was the smell of a land grab. The wind hit the cabin, a physical blow that made the timbers groan. In the sudden, quiet pause after the gust, a new sound emerged, a high, thin whistle, the kettle. It sounded impossibly domestic, impossibly safe, like a small, civilized spring bubbling up in the middle of the frozen waste. Silas slowly folded the crumpled paper, creasing it along its original lines, and handed it back to her. "Keep this," he said. "Keep it dry." He turned, poured the last of the boiling water into her cup, and brought it to her. "Drink the rest." Nora obeyed. The second cup went down easier. The shivering was subsiding, replaced by a deep, profound weariness that felt as heavy as the snow. The fire in the stove was a steady, radiating presence. She watched him move. He took his own heavy duster, a sheet of ice, and hung it on a thick peg by the door, where it immediately began to drip, forming a dark puddle on the floorboards. He checked the chinking by the window, his movements economical, accustomed to this space. He was a man who lived entirely within himself. The fight was over. The adrenaline, the cold, the terror, it all drained away at once, leaving a complete and total void. Her eyelids felt as if they were made of lead. She slumped sideways on the cot, her body finally surrendering to the warmth and the safety. Silas heard the change in her breathing, the sudden, heavy sigh of unconsciousness. He turned and looked at her for a long moment. Her face was pale, streaked with frozen tears and dirt, her dark hair matted against her cheek. She was a piece of flotsam washed into his fortress. He took the empty cup from her limp hand and set it on the table. He walked to his own bunk, pulled a thick, gray wool blanket from his bedroll, and unfolded it. He laid it over her, tucking it firmly around her shoulders. He did not go back to his own bunk. He took his rifle, a heavy Winchester, from the pegs on the wall. He checked the action, then sat in the simple wooden chair by the door, the rifle laid across his knees. The dog, Bristle, who had watched the entire exchange, finally stood. He stretched, a long, lupine motion, and walked to the cot. The dog sniffed at Nora's hand, which dangled near the floor. He gave a quiet huff, then circled twice before lying down with a heavy sigh. His body pressed against the floorboards, a solid, warm barrier against the draft that snaked under the door. The cabin fell into a deep quiet, marked only by the crackle of the fire, the steady, rhythmic breathing of the dog, and the wind screaming its frustration against the outer walls. Silas Pike sat guard. He had lived alone for so long that solitude was no longer a state of being. It was his armor. He was a man of the cold, of the long silences. But tonight, the silence was different. It was occupied. He listened to the woman's breathing, a fragile sound in the heart of the storm. In that profound, shared quiet, he felt something, a small, deep tremor, as if the foundation of his solitary life had just developed its first hairline crack. The snow stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The morning broke open a sky of blinding, painful blue, a color so deep it looked brittle. The world was scoured clean, silent, and buried. From the cabin's single window, Nora could see drifts that buried the fence line, sculpting the land into a new, alien geography. The only sign of life was the plume of smoke from the cabin's chimney, rising in a perfectly straight, gray line. Silas had been up for hours. She had woken to the smell of strong coffee and the sound of his shovel scraping stone and ice from the path to the lean-to stable. He moved with a relentless, energy-saving purpose. When he came back inside, his face was red from the wind, his beard glinting with frost. He didn't speak of yesterday. He handed her a cup of coffee, black and scalding, and a piece of hardtack. "Eat," he said. "We're going to Bitter Willow." She looked down at her damp, ruined dress. "I can't, I have—" He gestured to a hook on the wall. Hanging there was a pair of men's canvas trousers, worn but clean, and a heavy wool shirt. "They'll be big, but they're warm. My flour is low." It was a lie, or at least a partial one. His flour stores were fine, but he had seen the contract from Amos Fletch. He knew the clock was running. He went back outside to harness the big roan to a heavy-duty sled, leaving her to the privacy of changing. The trousers were absurdly large, held up only by a piece of rope he'd left on the table, but the wool shirt felt like armor. The journey to town was slow, a fight against a landscape that had become an obstacle course. They didn't speak. The horse, muscles bunching, pulled the sled through drifts 10 feet high, following a path only Silas seemed to know. Bitter Willow, when it finally appeared, looked like a child's toy town half drowned in white frosting. The main street was a narrow canyon carved between towering banks of snow, barely wide enough for one sled at a time. The moment they pulled up outside Otis Bell's general store, the silence broke. The town was alive, but it was the furtive life of a small, contained place after a disaster. Men were on roofs, shoveling, their voices carrying with unnatural clarity in the thin, cold air. The store was the heart. The pot-bellied stove in the center was roaring, a ring of wet gloves and socks steaming on the fender. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool, spilled kerosene, and chewing tobacco. When Silas Pike pushed the door open, the bell above it clanging, the half-dozen men inside stopped talking. They stopped. The scraping of a chair, the clink of a checker piece, it all ceased. Silas was a known quantity, a loner, a man who kept his own counsel and his fences mended. But the woman behind him, pale as bone, wearing his trousers, her dark hair tucked into his old hat. She was the variable. She was the story. Otis Bell, a man whose body was a collection of soft ovals, polished the counter with a dirty rag. "Mr. Pike, nasty one. Otis, need 50 pounds of flour, 20 of beans, coffee." Silas's voice was flat. A transaction. The whispers started as he spoke. They were not quiet enough. They were meant to be heard. "That's her, Rusk's wife. Heard Jebediah lost his wagon. Heard he just rode on in. Came in around midnight, frozen near solid. Well, where was she? That's Pike's Cut she's at. Spent the night, alone." The implication was as heavy and rank as the air in the room. A woman who had left her husband. A woman staying at a bachelor's ranch, in the high moral desert of the Wyoming Territory. The judgment was swift and absolute. Nora felt the heat rise in her face. She wanted to turn, to run back into the clean, uncaring snow. A sharp, clear voice cut through the murmuring. "A foolish woman leaves her home in a blizzard. A wise one takes any port offered." Nora turned. Eliza Merriweather was standing by the pickle barrel, a basket on her arm. She was a widow in her 50s, the town's unsanctioned pastor, a woman who held services in the schoolhouse and was feared more than the magistrate. Her eyes, sharp and dark, missed nothing. She walked directly to Nora, ignoring Silas, ignoring the men at the stove. "You look peaked. Child, you're Nora Vale's daughter, aren't you? I knew your father. He was a good man, stupid about many things, but a good man." She reached into her basket and pulled out a small glass jar filled with a pale, jellied substance. Chicken soup, rendered down. "This is from the church relief. You'll take it." It was a command. Nora, her hands trembling, took the cold jar. Eliza leaned closer, her voice dropping. a low, urgent hum just for Nora. "Jebediah has been talking. So has the railroad man. You're standing in a bad draft? Girl, your father told me once he'd found the heart of that creek. He said it was a secret God told him. Don't you let them steal it. And don't you sign a single thing Amos Fletch or any other man puts in front of you. You hear me? Not a single thing." She patted Nora's hand, a sharp, bird-like tap, and was gone. Sweeping out of the store, the whispers were silenced. Silas, his flour sack on his shoulder, nodded once. "We see Fletch." The magistrate's office was 2 doors down, a small, overheated room that smelled of stale cigar smoke and the bitter iron of cheap ink. Amos Fletch was a man built along the same lines as Otis Bell, but where Otis was soft, Fletch was slick. His waistcoat was too tight, a gold watch chain stretched across his paunch. His smile was a permanent, damp fixture. "Mr. Pike and Mrs. Rusk, a pleasure. I am so relieved to see you. Your husband was beside himself with worry." "We're here about her father's water claim," Silas said, getting straight to the point. He placed his hat on the desk. "The one for Spring Knife Creek." Fletch's smile didn't waver. He tented his fingers. "Ah, yes. A complicated matter. Truly, your husband, Mrs. Rusk, was in here just this morning. A whirlwind of concern. He has, provisionally empowered a Mr. Rourke of the Northern Union Rail Company to act in his interest, to protect his wife's assets. You see, in her unfortunate absence." "The land was her father's," Nora said, her voice small but clear. "It's my name on the homestead papers." Indeed. Fletch purred. "But territorial law, my dear lady, is very specific. A wife's property. Her chattels. Her land. It is all under the stewardship of her husband. And Mr. Rusk is your husband. He has the option. You have the... well," he waved a dismissive hand. "That paper he tried to force on her," Silas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "It's not valid." Of course not. Not without her willing signature, which is why we must legalize the entire matter. Settle the claim. I've scheduled a hearing at the county courthouse, a week from today, Tuesday. Just a simple formality, to hear all sides and clear the title. Mr. Rusk will be there. Mr. Rourke will be there. And you, my dear, should be there." He smiled. "Now, if you'll excuse me, the town has many needs." They were dismissed. They stepped back out onto the wooden boardwalk, the sun a white fire in the sky, reflecting off every surface, and they saw him. Across the street, exiting the saloon, was Jebediah. He was clean-shaven. He wore a new, city-bought wool coat. His arm was linked through the arm of another man. This man was not from Wyoming. He wore a dark, 3-piece suit, polished boots, and a bowler hat. His face was pale, intelligent, and completely devoid of warmth. His eyes, as they scanned the street, were the color and texture of black ice. This was Thadley Rourke. Jeb saw Nora. He saw her standing next to Silas Pike. He saw her wearing Silas Pike's clothes. A dark flush of shame, or perhaps anger, crossed his face. He pulled his arm free from Rourke's. Rourke, however, simply smiled. He looked at Nora, then at Silas, his gaze lingering, assessing the man from Pike's cut with the calculating eye of an engineer measuring an obstacle. He seemed to find the obstacle insignificant. He spoke, his voice not loud, but cutting. It carried across the snow-filled street as if it were a parlor. "Mr. Rusk," Rourke said, pulling a cigar from his pocket, "your concern for your wife is admirable, but progress, as I've said, has its own schedule. That little trickle you call Spring Knife Creek is a vital artery for the railroad." He looked directly at Nora, a thin, patronizing smile playing on his lips. "We'll be erecting a temporary dam, ma'am. By the end of the week, just a preliminary survey of the flow. You understand, all perfectly legal. Sometimes, these stubborn homesteaders in the territories must be encouraged to see the bigger picture. Water is a commodity, not a prayer." He tipped his bowler hat to her. "Ma'am, Jebediah wouldn't meet her eyes. He just stood there, a puppet in a new coat. Nora's hand, inside the canvas pocket, closed around the cold glass jar from Eliza. Her other hand, inside her shirt, found the stiff leather of her father's satchel. She could feel, through the leather, the raised, inked lines of the map, the secret veins of the aquifer, drawn by a hand that was now dust. They felt like the veins on the back of her own hand. They felt like her own blood, pulsing slow and steady. Silas had not moved. He said nothing. He simply stood beside her, his shoulders broad, his body a solid fact. He was a wall against the wind, against the whispers, against the polite, venomous threats of Thadley Rourke. He was just there. Rourke and Jebediah turned and walked toward the magistrate's office. Nora looked away from them, her gaze traveling up the front of the building, past the false front, to the roof line. Icicles, long as a man's arm, hung from the eaves, dripping in the sudden, bright sun. As she watched, the sun glinted off something dark in the wood, a single rusty nail, half pulled from the gutter plank by the weight of the ice. As the meltwater ran over it, the icicle it held shifted. The nail groaned, pulled a fraction of an inch further from the wood, and made a single, sharp sound. Tack. It was a tiny sound, lost in the vast, white valley. But to Nora, it sounded as loud as a hammer striking an anvil. It was an omen, a sound of something deep, frozen, and under immense pressure, just beginning to give way. The sled ride back to Pike's Cut was a different kind of silent. The first journey had been the silence of survival, a desperate, numbed, clinging to life. This was the silence of calculation. The threat was no longer the abstract, impersonal malice of the storm. It had a name, Thadley Rourke, and a deadline, 1 week. Back in the cabin, the oppressive warmth of the stove was a fortress. Silas stoked the fire, his movements economical, his face a mask of concentration. "He said temporary dam," Nora said, speaking to the fire. "He'll move men in tomorrow. By the time the hearing starts, the water will already be gone. Fletch will rule that a dry creek has no claim." "He's right," Silas said. He didn't look at her. He looked at the map of Spring Knife Creek, which he had pinned to the wall with 2 small nails. "The law out here isn't what's written. It's what's done. Whoever holds the water by Tuesday holds the water. Then we have to stop him. We have to beat him. Fletch and Rourke are playing a legal game. We need to play a better one. Your husband gave them the key. But your father, what did he leave you?" Her mind went blank, then flashed. "The trunk, my father's field trunk. It's at the homestead. Jebediah's there." "No," she said, a cold certainty settling in her. "He wouldn't be, not after seeing me. He's at the saloon, or the boarding house. He's Rourke's man now. The homestead is empty." Silas nodded once. He grabbed his rifle from the peg. "Get your coat." The trip to her homestead was short, less than 2 miles over the ridge, but it felt like crossing a border into a dead country. The wagon, her wagon, was still where he'd left it, a shattered, snow-shrouded monument to his betrayal. The cabin itself was cold. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was frigid and still. A few of Jeb's belongings were gone: his razor, his good boots. The rest was as she'd left it. It was a violated space. The trunk was at the foot of her cot, a simple pine box bound with iron. Her father's initials, T.V. for Thomas Vale, were burned into the lid. It wasn't locked. Silas stood by the door, his rifle cradled, watching the snow-covered lane. He was a sentinel, giving her this space. Nora knelt and opened it. The smell of old leather, dry paper, and faint, mineral earth rose to meet her. This was her father. This was his life. She lifted the items out, one by one, a geologist's hammer, a set of drafting tools, and then the papers. They were wrapped in oilcloth. She untied the string with numb fingers. It was a stack of ledgers, receipts, and diaries. "What am I looking for?" she whispered. "Anything with a date," Silas said from the door. "Anything with a seal. Proof he was here first, and proof he used the water." She spread them on the dusty floor. A sheaf of tax receipts, paid in full to the territorial office, dated every year for a decade. Each one had a handwritten notation in the margin. Homestead, 160 acres, irrigated. He paid taxes on it, she said, her voice rising. He told them it was irrigated land. Good, Silas said. That's good. She dug deeper. A thin ledger, a drilling log. Her father's precise, angular script filled the pages. Dates, depths, soil types. And then, a page dated May 14th, 1877, 9 years ago. Struck water, 20 feet, adjacent to the old knife marker. Flow consistent, good puttability. This is the one, TV. The old knife marker, Nora read aloud. I remember that. It's a big, split boulder on the north line, shaped like a blade. He and some of the Shoshone men, they set a post there. He marked his claim, Silas said, stepping into the room. Before the land office even drew the lines. First in time, first in right. That's the law of the water. Older than the territory. He was the first appropriator. At the bottom of the trunk was a folded, official-looking document. A homestead certificate. It was filled out, signed by her father. But the final stamp of approval from the land office in Cheyenne was missing. It was incomplete. This is it, she said, her heart sinking. It's not finished. He never filed the final proof. Silas took the paper from her. He studied it. Then the tax receipts. Then the drilling log. He pieced them together on the floor like a puzzle. The filing is just paper. Nora, the work is the right. The log proves when he found it. The tax receipts prove he claimed it, every year, to the government. This incomplete paper shows his intent. This is the proof. Rourke has an option from your husband. You have a decade of your father's life. He gathered the papers. We need to show this to someone who isn't Fletch. Eliza Merriweather lived in a small, neat house behind the schoolhouse. She opened the door before they knocked, as if expecting them. She ushered them into a parlor that smelled of lemon oil and old books. I expected you, she said, closing the curtains. The wolf, Rourke, and the jackal, Fletch, are dining at the hotel. We have an hour. Silas laid the papers on her table. Eliza put on a pair of small, wire-rimmed spectacles and read. She read with a scholar's intensity. She touched the drilling log, her finger tracing the date. Thomas Vale, she murmured. He was a good man, a dreamer, but his dreaming was practical. This is his hand. This is his work. Is it enough? Nora asked. Fletch has set a hearing. Fletch will bury you in procedure, Eliza said, snapping the papers into a neat pile. He will say these are just a farmer's diaries. He will say Jebediah, as your husband, has authority. You are a woman, and he is your husband. That is the beginning and the end of Fletch's law. Then what do we do? Silas asked. We find a bigger law. Eliza went to her desk. There is a man in town. He's been here a month, staying at the boarding house, asking quiet questions about cattle contracts and land fees. He's the reason Fletch is so nervous. He's a deputy United States Marshal, and he's not here by accident. She scribbled a note. His name is Quentin Hargreave. He is investigating Amos Fletch for corruption on behalf of the federal government. Quentin Hargreave did not look like the law. He was a slight man, younger than Silas, with a weary face and intelligent eyes. They met him in the livery stable, the only place in town they would not be overheard. The air was warm with the breath of horses and the smell of hay. Hargreave listened. He leaned against a stall, his coat open, and just listened. He examined the papers under the dim light of a lantern, his hand surprisingly gentle. This is a strong case, he said, his voice quiet. The log, the tax receipts. This establishes first appropriation better than any formal deed. But Rourke will have a counter-argument. What? Nora asked. Abandonment. He'll claim your father found the water. Yes, but never used it. That he abandoned the right. Let it lapse. The law requires beneficial and continuous use. He'll say, Jebediah Rusk, as the current steward, has the right to sell the lapsed claim. But he did use it. Nora insisted. He dug irrigation ditches. We watered a garden. Who saw him? Hargreave interrupted, his voice kind but firm. Who besides you can stand in Fletch's courtroom and swear they saw your father use that water from that creek every single year? The men who whispered about you in the store, they'll side with Jebediah. You need a witness Fletch can't discredit. The livery was silent. The horses shifted in their stalls. Silas, who had been standing in the shadows, spoke. Samuel. Hargreave and Nora both looked at him. Samuel 2 Moons, Silas said, stepping into the light. He's a healer, lives with the Shoshone encampment north of my land. He and I are old friends. He knew her father. He worked for him. He helped dig those ditches. Hargreave's eyes lit with a sudden, keen interest. A Shoshone witness. Fletch will try to dismiss him, but he can't ignore him. Not in a federal matter. If he can testify to continuous use, that, with these papers, will bind Fletch's hands. Get him! That night, the urgency was a third person in Silas's cabin. They were no longer just defending, they were building a case. While Silas rode out to find Samuel 2 Moons, Nora sat at the table. She looked at her father's map. It was the key. It was the one thing that could be lost, or stolen. She found a piece of clean oilcloth in Silas's pantry. With a piece of charcoal, she began to copy. Her hand, which had trembled in the general store, was now perfectly steady. She traced every line, every notation, her father's mark for the spring, the faint lines of the underground aquifer, the location of the old knife marker. When she was done, she warmed Silas's sewing awl by the fire. She carefully slit the thick wool lining of the coat he had given her, the one that had been his. She folded the oilcloth map flat, slid it inside, and, with clumsy, determined stitches, sewed the lining shut. The map was hidden, a secret, lying just over her heart. Hours later, Silas returned. He was not alone. Samuel 2 Moons was tall, ageless, his face a map of the land itself. He moved with a grace that made the cabin seem small. He accepted a cup of tea, his dark eyes fixed on Nora. I knew your father, Samuel said. His voice was like stones rolling in a riverbed. He was a man who listened to the rock. I helped him find the water. I helped him dig the first channel. He gave my family grain in the hard winters. I will speak for him. Rourke's men are at the creek, Silas said, addressing Samuel. They plan to build a dam. They've already been at the marker. Samuel's eyes narrowed. They've moved the stone. I don't know, Silas said, but we're going to find out. Tonight. Bristle, the gray dog, seemed to understand. He whined, his body taut with excitement. The three of them, Silas, Nora, and Samuel, rode out from the ranch, Bristle running ahead. They didn't take the main path. Samuel led them along a high, winding game trail. The moon was nearly full, and the world was a silent, stark landscape of blue snow and black shadow. Bristle ranged ahead, a gray ghost, then stopped. He stood, nose to the wind, at the edge of a shallow, snow-filled depression. This is it, Nora whispered. The old irrigation ditch. The dog moved forward, not running, but sniffing, tracking a scent. He led them for a quarter mile, then stopped, a low growl rumbling in his chest. They saw it at the same time. The old knife marker, a massive granite boulder split by ice, stood like a sentinel. But something was wrong. The snow around it was trampled, churned, and the heavy cedar post her father had set beside it, the one with his initials carved into it, was gone. Samuel dismounted and walked to the rock. He pointed to a deep hole in the frozen earth. They pulled it up. Silas found the post tossed aside in a snowdrift, like a piece of trash. Rourke's men had been here. They were erasing her father's claim. A cold, pure rage filled Nora. Silas looked at the rock, at the hole, at the discarded post. His face was granite. He walked to the boulder. He took his knife from the sheath on his belt. He didn't try to find the old marks. He found a clean, flat face on the boulder, and with strong, deliberate strokes, He began to carve. He cut a deep, clear S. He cut a P. He connected them. Then he carved a V, nesting it inside the P. Silas Pike, Nora Vale, a new mark, a new claim. When he was finished, he took a piece of charcoal from his saddlebag. He pulled a folded piece of paper, a receipt from his pocket, flattened it against the new carving, and rubbed the charcoal over it. The dark, clear mark transferred to the paper. He folded it and handed it to Nora. New proof. As they stood there, the only sound the wind in the pines. Samuel tilted his head. He looked down the canyon, towards the audible, muffled rush of Spring Knife Creek. He pointed with his chin. There, in the blue moonlight, stark against the untouched snow, was a line of tracks. Not moccasins, not the worn boots of a rancher. They were new, deep, with a clear, sharp heel. The tracks of several men. They led from the desecrated marker, down the ditch, and disappeared into the shadows toward the creek. Toward the place Rourke's dam was already beginning to rise. The tracks led them down into the gullet of the canyon, where the roar of Spring Knife Creek was louder, angrier. The air was colder here, a pocket of trapped night that the moon could not fully illuminate. They left the horses with Samuel, who blended into the shadows of a juniper grove, a silent promise to wait. Bristle moved ahead, not a dog, but a low, gray shadow, his paws making no sound on the pine needle-covered ground. Silas and Nora followed, moving from boulder to boulder. The smell of wet earth and pine was suddenly cut by a new, sharp scent raw, splintered wood, and the unmistakable odor of a dozen men living rough. They saw the lamplight first, a sickly yellow glow against the snow. They crawled the last 50 yards on their bellies to the edge of a small clearing. The dam was a brutal, ugly thing, a raw scar of felled trees and blasted rock, cabled together, already forcing the creek into a deep, sullen pool. Thadley Rourke stood on a log, pointing, his city coat replaced by a heavy mackinaw. He was not just supervising, he was directing a war. 4 men were working with a heavy steel drill, pounding it into the canyon wall just above the pooled water, their grunts and the clang of the sledgehammer echoing flatly. They were setting charges. This was no temporary survey. This was a permanent, violent diversion. Silas put his mouth next to Nora's ear. His breath was warm, smelling faintly of coffee in the cold night air. Dynamite! He's not diverting it. He's closing it. He'll blow the canyon wall, create a rock slide, and bury the spring. The proof. The courtroom. It all seemed small, irrelevant, in the face of the sledgehammer and the dynamite. Silas touched her arm. A sharp, backward tug. We leave. Nora's eyes were fixed on the pooled water. Just at the edge of the light, bolted to a post set in the creek bed, was a measuring gauge. A metal tube, painted white, with black markings. It was her father's. It was the tool he had used to log the creek's flow. And right now, the dark, still water was sitting high against its marks, a clear, physical lie, showing a depth that was not natural. She needed that reading. She needed to know, to be able to swear to the original flow. She shook her head. A small, stubborn gesture. No. A dark shape detached itself from the group of men and walked toward the shadows where they lay. Unbuttoning his trousers. A lookout, taking a moment's pause. He stopped, head tilted, listening. Perhaps Bristle had shifted a paw. Perhaps his own breathing was too loud. The man's hand moved, not to his trousers, but to the pistol on his hip. Before the man's fingers could even find the leather, Silas moved. He was not a rancher. He was a force of nature. He rose from the snow in one silent, explosive motion. There was no shout, no warning, just the solid, wet thud of his body hitting the lookouts. Silas's left hand clamped over the man's mouth, stifling the cry, his right arm locking around the man's throat. They went down together in a tangle of limbs. There was a brief, terrible, muffled struggle, the sound of boots drumming on the frozen mud, a choking gasp, and then stillness. Silas had not made a sound. From the man's belt, Silas unclipped a small, tin box. He opened it. Detonator caps. He looked at them for 1 second. Then, with a sharp, underhand flick, he threw the entire tin into the churning, muddy water below the new dam. They were gone. Nora didn't watch. The moment Silas moved, she ran. She didn't run away. She ran toward the dam, keeping low, a shadow slipping between shadows. The sound of the sledgehammer covered the sound of her boots. She reached the crude wooden scaffolding and slipped beneath it. The air was thick with the smell of wet, raw timber. Water dripped from the logs above, soaking her hair, her shoulders. A frigid, fine rain began to fall, a sleet that stung her cheeks and hands. She was directly beneath the enemy. She fumbled in her pocket for the piece of chalk Silas had used on the rock. Her fingers, numb, found it. She reached the post with the measuring gauge. She wiped the icy grime away with her sleeve. The water was unnaturally high, pushed up by the dam, reading nearly 5 feet, but she could see, just at the ground level, a faint, dark stain, the old water line. She made her mark. A single, horizontal white line at the old mark, the true mark, 2 feet. She scraped the chalk over it again and again, grinding it into the wood. Proof. A low, threatening growl came from beside her. Bristle. The dog had followed her. He wasn't looking at her, he was looking at the water. A thin rope, covered in ice, stretched from the post to a bobbing float that measured the current. The rope was taut, straining in the artificial pool. Bristle saw it as an offense, a tether, a thing that was wrong. He lunged, his teeth snapping onto the rope. He bit, twisted, his powerful neck muscles bunching. The rope, frozen and brittle, snapped with a sound like a pistol shot. The float, freed, shot away like an arrow, disappearing into the dark, churning water downstream. The illegal interference was now a broken, physical fact. "Hey, what was that?" a voice shouted from the dam. The hammering stopped. Silas was suddenly there, emerging from the darkness. He grabbed Nora's hand, his grip like a steel trap. "Now!" He pulled her back, scrambling over the rocks, into the deep shadows of the pines. They ran, bent double, the dog a silent gray streak at their heels. They reached the juniper grove, their lungs burning. "What happened?" Samuel asked, his voice calm, already holding the reins of the roan. "They lost their gauge," Silas said, breathing hard. He didn't wait. He took a piece of charcoal from his own pocket, found a flat-faced boulder on the path, and drew a single, clean arrow pointing back the way they had come, back toward the old knife marker. A message for Hargreave. A map to the truth. He swung into the saddle, then reached down and pulled Nora up behind him, settling her against his back. He wrapped her arms around his waist. "Hold on." The horse lunged, scrambling up the steep game trail. Nora clung to him, her face pressed against the rough, cold wool of his coat. She was shaking, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that came not from the cold, but from the raw, sharp terror of the moment. She could feel the solid wall of his body, the strength in it. Her heart was a frantic drum against his back, and beneath her ear, she heard a steady, rhythmic, metallic beat. Tick, tick, tick. His pocket watch. It was in his breast pocket, right against his heart. It was a sound of absolute, mechanical calm. A clock, ticking in the middle of chaos. Her own racing pulse began to slow, falling into rhythm with the steady, reliable beat of the watch. They were halfway up the canyon ridge, safe in the trees, when the world turned white. A silent, brilliant flash erupted from the valley below, painting the snow, the trees, and their faces in a stark, momentary yellow. It was followed, a second later, by a low, hollow whump, a sound that seemed to punch the air from their lungs. Silas reined in the horse. They both turned, down at the creek. A secondary fire bloomed, brighter, angrier. It wasn't the dam. The dam was still there. It was the tent, the workers' canvas tent, pitched 100 yards from the dam, was a roaring column of orange flame. "The caps," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "I threw them in the water, but their main store, the powder, the rest of the dynamite, it must have been in the tent." A spark, a careless match, a box of wet, Malfunctioning caps left too close to the stove, cooking off from the heat. It didn't matter. The result was a devastating, self-inflicted wound. As the echo of the explosion died, rolling between the high, cold peaks, a new sound traveled on the wind. It was faint at first, then clearer, driven by the storm. Clang, clang, clang! It was the bell from Eliza Merriweather's church in Bitter Willow. The flash, a beacon of disaster, had been seen. The town was waking. It was not a gentle Sunday ringing. It was frantic, urgent, a relentless rhythm. It was an alarm, a summons. It sounded as if it were calling their names. They rode back under a new, tender fall of snow. The flakes were large and slow, drifting down in the sudden, ringing silence. The explosion and the frantic clangor of the bell had faded behind them, swallowed by the ridges and the vast, white insulation of the territory. The world was muffled, holding its breath. Nora was pressed against Silas's back, her arms locked around his waist. The adrenaline had evaporated, leaving a cold, hollow space. She was shaking again, but it was a different tremor now. It was not the body's fight against the cold. It was the soul's reaction to the vacuum left by terror. She had run. She had hidden. She had marked the post. She had been saved. His body was a solid, unmoving wall. She focused on the steady tick, tick, tick of the pocket watch in his breast. A sound as reliable as a heartbeat. A small engine of order in a world gone mad. When they reached the cabin, the single yellow square of the window was a beacon. It was the only light, the only point of warmth, in 100 square miles of frozen blue shadow. Silas swung down from the roan, his movement stiff with cold. He reached up, his hands spanning her waist, and lifted her down. Her legs, numb and weak, buckled. He caught her easily, his grip firm, holding her upright for a moment before letting her go. He pushed the cabin door open. A wave of dry, profound warmth washed over them. The fire in the stove, which he had banked with heavy logs hours ago, had burned down to a deep, pulsating bed of red-orange embers. The cabin was a pocket of preserved heat, a cave of safety. Nora stumbled inside, moving toward the stove as if pulled by a rope. Silas followed, closing the door and dropping the thick wooden bar into place. The sound of the bar sliding home was a note of finality. The wind, the bell, the explosion, they were outside. They were locked out. He moved past her, his heavy, ice-crusted coat shedding shards of ice that hissed as they hit the floor near the stove. He lit the oil lamp on the table, and the room bloomed in a soft, steady, yellow light. The sleet from the canyon had soaked them. As the heat hit their clothes, steam began to rise. It ghosted from her hair, from the shoulders of the wool coat he had given her, from his own gloved hands. They stood, two smoking, steaming figures in the small, warm room, the silence heavy between them. She couldn't stop shaking. Her hands, when she held them out to the stove, were vibrating, her fingers dancing with a life of their own. "It's the adrenaline," Silas said. His voice was rough, as if he hadn't used it in a long time. "It's leaving you." He turned to a shelf and took down a clean, rough towel. He didn't hand it to her. He stepped in front of her, between her and the stove, and began to dry her hair. His movements were not gentle. They were the same efficient, methodical motions he had used to rub the life back into her frozen legs. He scrubbed her scalp, his knuckles rough, his focus absolute. He was drying her hair as he would a horse, and yet it was the most profound act of care she had ever known. When he was finished, he let the towel drop to her shoulders. He stepped back, but she still felt the force of his presence. He looked at her, his eyes dark in the lamplight. "You need to get out of those wet things," he said. He gestured to his bunk, where his own dry clothes lay. She nodded, but her hands were useless. She tried to unbutton the heavy coat, the one with her father's map sewn into its lining, but her fingers were clumsy. Shaking too hard to find the buttonholes, he watched her fumble, his expression unreadable. He let out a low, frustrated breath. He stepped forward again, and with a decisiveness that allowed no argument, he brushed her hands aside. His thick, calloused fingers found the first button. He worked it free, then the second. His knuckles brushed the skin of her neck, and she flinched. Not from fear, but from the sudden, sharp reality of his touch. He paused, his hand in the air. "Nora!" He just said her name. It was an anchor. She looked at him, truly looked at him. For the first time, not as a savior, not as a wall, as a man. His face was etched with lines from the sun and the wind. His beard was trimmed short. His eyes were deep-set and tired. He was a man who had seen too many winters. He went back to the buttons. He was slower now, more deliberate. He finished the coat and slid it from her shoulders. It fell to the floor, a heavy, sodden ring of wool. She stood before him in the damp, oversized shirt and the canvas trousers. He still had his gloves on, the heavy mule-hide shells that were his armor against the world. He had taken them off only once before, in the storm, to save her life. He looked at his own hands, then at her face, and with a slow, conscious movement, he pulled the right glove off, finger by finger. He tossed it onto the table. He lifted his bare hand. The skin was scarred, chapped, red from the cold, but alive. He hesitated, his hand hovering in the air between them. A silent question. Nora did not pull away. She stood her ground. He laid his hand against her cheek. The same gesture he had used in the heart of the blizzard. But it was not the same. Then, it had been a shock, a brutal transfer of life. Now, it was a discovery. The heat of his palm was a brand, a claim, a comfort. His thumb moved, just once, tracing the line of her cheekbone. His eyes searched hers, looking for something he seemed to have forgotten existed. "I have been alone too long," he whispered. The words were not an admission. They were a confession, a truth torn from the deepest, most guarded part of him. Her breath caught. This man, this silent, solitary mountain of a man, was as lost as she was. He was not just saving her, he was seeing her. Her gaze dropped from his eyes to his hand, then to his wrist. A thin, white line, a crescent moon, disappeared beneath the cuff of his shirt. A scar, old, clean, precise, a mark left by something sharp, something that had tested him long ago. She raised her own hand. It was still shaking, but she controlled it. She did not touch his face. She did not answer his caress. Instead, she laid her palm flat against the inside of his wrist, her fingers covering the scar. It was an answer without words. "I see you. I, too, am marked." His breath stopped. The simple, trusting pressure of her hand on his scar was an act of profound intimacy. It was an acceptance of all the broken, hidden parts of him. He closed his eyes. His other hand, the gloved one, came up and found her shoulder. He pulled her to him. It was not a request. It was a need. She fell against his chest, her ear landing over the steady, ticking heart of his watch. Her own hands, one on his wrist, the other on his chest, splayed out, clinging to him. He wrapped both arms around her, the gloved hand and the bare one, and held her. He held her as if he were holding a piece of himself that had been lost in the snow and just, finally, found. They stood like that for a long time. 2 columns of steam rising in the heat. The only sound the crackle of the embers and the rising moan of the wind outside. He held her, and she let herself be held. She let the last of the fear, the betrayal of Jebediah, the terror of the dam, the icy cold of the grave, she let it all go, transferring the weight of it to the solid, unmoving man who had taken it without asking. His warm breath, moving the damp hair at her temple, was the only thing that mattered. She felt his chest expand, felt the rumble of his voice before she heard it. "Nora." She tilted her head back. Her cheek was still pressed to the rough wool of his shirt. Her eyes found his. He looked at her, and the loneliness in his gaze was so vast, so deep, it threatened to swallow her. But there was something else there, too, a heat that had nothing to do with the stove. He lowered his head. It was achingly slow. He was giving her every chance to turn away, to retreat. She did not move. She waited. His lips touched hers. It was not a collision. It was a landing. It was the gentlest, softest thing she had ever felt. It was just the bare, hesitant pressure of his mouth. Then he paused, as if asking a final question. She answered by rising on her toes, pressing herself closer, her hand sliding from his wrist up his arm, her fingers tangling in the thick wool at his shoulder. The kiss deepened. It was not the hungry, demanding kiss of Jebediah, a kiss that always took. This was a kiss that gave. It was slow, unhurried, and profound. It was a kiss of shared warmth, of silent understanding, of a promise made in the heart of a storm. It was a kiss that tasted of coffee and cold air and the faint, clean salt of her own tears, which had melted on his cheek. They breathed each other in. The small cabin, the fire, the wind had all dissolved. There was only this anchor, this heat. He shifted, turning them slightly, and the warmth of their shared breath hit the cold window pane. A circle of fog bloomed on the glass, a soft, white veil that blurred the harsh, blue-white world outside. They were enclosed, hidden. His gloved hand dropped from her back, and he stripped the heavy glove from his other hand, tossing it aside. He needed no more armor. Both his hands, bare and scarred, came up to frame her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. He broke the kiss, but only to rest his forehead against hers. They stood, eye to eye, breath to breath, shoulder to shoulder. The coats and gloves, the defenses of the world, lay forgotten on the floor. Outside, the new snow began to fall harder, the sound of it a soft, brushing rhythm against the roof, a quiet music that filled the space their hearts had left silent. He looked at her, his eyes tracing every line of her face, as if memorizing her. He saw the weariness, the strength, the pale, fragile resilience. With a low sound, a sound of surrender, he bent. He slid one arm under her knees and the other around her back, lifting her as easily as he had lifted her from the snowdrift. She made no protest. Her arms circled his neck, her face burying in the warm, safe hollow of his shoulder. He carried her, not to the cold cot, but to the one place in the room that offered true comfort. He crossed the floor and knelt, laying her gently on the thick bear fur rug that lay before the stove. The fur was warm, the embers of the fire painting their faces in a deep, pulsating, rosy light. He did not release her. He lay down on his side, half beside her, half over her, one arm still protectively around her waist, supporting himself on his other elbow. He looked down at her. "Nora?" he whispered again, the sound rough. "Stay, stay." It was a plea, it was a command, it was a prayer. She reached up and touched his face. Her fingers, no longer shaking, traced the line of his jaw, felt the rough stubble of his beard. He was real. This was real. He lowered his head again, but this time his kiss was different. It was not just comfort, it was a question. His lips moved over hers, and she answered, her hands moving from his face to his hair, her fingers tangling in the thick, damp strands. They did not speak. There were no words for this. This was a language of touch, of heat, of trust. He pulled the thick wool blanket from his own bunk and drew it over them, cocooning them in the small circle of firelight. He held her, his arms wrapped tight, his body a long, warm line against hers. She pressed her face into his chest, her hands clasped between them, her own fingers lacing with his, their hands, scarred and chapped, clasped together, a perfect, broken fit. He murmured her name into her hair, a low, constant sound of discovery. It was the sound of a man finding a home he never knew he was looking for. This was not a fire. It was an ember, a deep, radiant heat that promised to burn through the long, cold night. It was the feeling of two frozen, solitary hearts, thawed by a sudden, impossible grace, finally, beginning to beat as one. The embers in the stove crackled, a spark flaring bright. It cast a brief, bright light over them, illuminating her dark, tangled hair, spread across the dark fur. It lit the silent, unmoving shape of the man who held her. It was a vow, made in firelight and shadow, unspoken and unbreakable. The county meeting room was not a hall of justice. It was a long, narrow box built of raw pine, smelling of unseasoned wood, wet wool, and the bitter metallic heat of the pot-bellied stove in the center, which was running far too hot. There were not enough benches. Men stood 3 deep against the walls, their hats in their hands, their faces grim. They were not here for entertainment. They were here to see which way the wind of power was about to blow. At the front, on a raised platform, Judge Elias Thorne sat behind a simple plank table. He was a circuit judge, a weary man with a face like dried leather, who valued speed over eloquence. Beside him, looking smaller, damper, and far more nervous, was Amos Fletch, the local magistrate. Nora and Silas sat on a hard bench to the left. Silas was impassive, his large hands resting on his knees, his rifle leaning against the wall behind him. He watched, not the judge, but Thadley Rourke. Nora sat beside him, her father's leather satchel in her lap. She was wearing the one good dress Eliza Merriweather had found for her, a dark, practical wool that felt like a costume. On the right sat Jebediah, clean-shaven and wearing his new coat. He looked pale and refused to meet her eyes. Beside him was Thadley Rourke, who looked as calm and precise as if he were in a Boston bank, and a thin, sharp-faced lawyer from Cheyenne, who carried a briefcase full of railroad papers. Amos Fletch stood, clearing his throat, his voice slick with false humility. "Judge Thorne, gentlemen, we are gathered for a preliminary hearing on the matter of the Vale homestead, specifically the water rights to Spring Knife Creek, a simple matter of stewardship. Really, Mr. Jebediah Rusk, as the legal husband of Nora Vale Rusk, has—" "Let's get to it. Fletch," the judge interrupted, his voice dry as dust. "Call your first witness." Fletch blinked. "Yes, Your Honor. I call Mr. Jebediah Rusk." Jebediah walked to the platform, his new boots squeaking in the silence. He was sworn in, his hand trembling slightly. Fletch began, his questions soft. "Leading, Mr. Rusk, is it true that you hold the legal and moral authority for your wife's property?" "Yes, sir. I am her husband. Before God." "And is it true that, in your best judgment, a fair option was presented by Mr. Rourke of the Northern Union Rail Company for a lapsed and unused water claim?" "Objection," a new voice said, clear and firm. Every head turned. Quentin Hargreave, the deputy USA. Marshall was standing at the back of the room. He walked forward, parting the crowd. "And who in blazes are you?" Judge Thorne demanded. "Deputy U.S. Marshal Quentin Hargreave. Your Honor, I am here on federal authority. This is not a domestic property dispute. It is a federal matter involving potential land and water fraud, conspiracy, and illegal obstruction of a waterway by a party, namely the Northern Union Rail Company, which intends to operate across territorial lines." The room went absolutely silent. Fletch's face went from pink to a mottled, pasty white. Rourke's lawyer shot to his feet. "This is an outrage. Your Honor, a local water claim." "It stopped being a local claim. Counsel," Hargreave said, his voice cutting through. "When your client's men illegally destroyed a federal survey marker, began construction of an unpermitted dam, and conspired with a local official to extinguish a prior, established water right, I ask the court to hear my evidence." Judge Thorne looked at Fletch, then at Rourke, then at Hargreave. A slow, dangerous light came into his eyes. He had smelled a rat, and now it had a uniform. "Proceed, Marshal. And this is my courtroom. You, counsel, will sit down." Hargreave turned to Jebediah, who looked like he was about to be sick. "Mr. Rusk, you claim this water right was lapsed and unused. On what do you base that claim?" It was just a ditch, dry half the time. My wife, she's sentimental, but it was worthless." "And is that why?" Hargreave pressed. "You attempted to force your wife, Nora Vale Rusk, to sign this option contract." He produced the crumpled, ink-stained paper. "And when she refused, did you or did you not abandon her? In the midst of a blizzard that had already killed hundreds of cattle, to die of exposure, A collective gasp went through the room. This was no longer about water. This was about the oldest, most brutal laws of the frontier. Jebediah fell apart. No, I wouldn't. She refused her wifely duties. She abandoned me. She left our home. She ran off. He pointed a shaking finger at Silas. She ran off with him. She's an adulteress. She has no right. Nora felt the blood leave her face. The whispers from the crowd were now a hostile hiss. Silas did not move a muscle. He just watched. A convenient accusation, Hargreaves said calmly. One you manufactured after you left her for dead, Your Honor. I will prove that the right was not lapsed, that it was in continuous use, and that Mr. Rusk and Mr. Rourke have conspired to steal it. He unrolled a piece of paper on the judge's table. It was the charcoal rubbing Silas had made. This is a rubbing from the old knife marker, Your Honor, the V for Vale, and the SP for Silas Pike, placed after Mr. Rourke's men vandalized the original claim post. First, I call Mr. Samuel 2 Moons. The door opened. Samuel entered. The room, filled with ranchers and townsmen, bristled. Rourke's lawyer was on his feet again. Objection, the testimony of this man is not admissible. He is a free man and a taxpayer in this territory. Hargreaves snapped. And he will be heard, Mr. 2 Moons. Do you know the land at Spring Knife Creek? Samuel stood, his presence filling the front of the room. I do. I was there when Thomas Vale, her father, first struck the spring. I helped him dig the first irrigation ditch with my own hands. When was this? It was the summer of 1877, before the railroad laid its first survey line, before most of the men in this room had even crossed the Platte. And was the water used? Every year, Samuel said, his voice resonating. He watered a corn patch and beans. He watered his horses. When his garden was full, he told my people to take what water they needed for their own animals. He was a man who shared the water. It has never been lapsed. It has never been abandoned. Hargreave nodded. Thank you. I next call Eliza Merriweather. Eliza walked forward, her black dress rustling. She placed a large, leather-bound book on the table. This is the First Territorial Church Ledger. Your Honor, I am its keeper. It is the only record of births, deaths, and baptisms in Bitter Willow for the last 15 years. And does it mention Spring Knife Creek? It does, Eliza said, her voice clear and sharp. She opened the book. I draw the court's attention to an entry from August 4th, 1879, the baptism of Sarah Price. I have noted in the margin service delayed, attendees drawing from Spring Knife Creek for the harvest. And again, July 12th, 1881, a note on the summer drought. Creek beds dry, all save Spring Knife, which flows steady. And again. That's enough, Judge Thorne said. He looked at Rourke. Continuous use seems well established. Counsel. Finally, Hargreaves said, I submit this. He placed a small piece of wood, the chunk of the post Nora had marked, on the table. The white chalk line was clear. Mr. Rourke's illegal dam has pooled the water to a depth of nearly 5 feet in an attempt to flood the springhead and declare it unmanageable. The true water line, as marked here by Mrs. Rusk, is at 2 feet. This is not stewardship. This is active, criminal destruction. The case was collapsing. Jebediah was weeping into his hands. Rourke's lawyer was shuffling papers, his face pale. Thadley Rourke stood up. His suit was perfect. His face was pale with a rage that was glacial, immense. He was no longer a banker. He was a force of pure, cold will. This is an absolute circus, he said, his voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the room. You sit here in this drafty shack, listening to the ramblings of an old woman and a savage, and you call it a court. Mr. Rourke, I advise you, his lawyer began. Be silent, Rourke snapped. He pointed a finger, not at Hargreave, but at Judge Thorne. You think this matters? You think your little ruling stops anything that dam will be completed? The Northern Union Rail Company requires that water to cross this desolate land. The railroad will have that water. We will divert that stream. We will take that spring, regardless of what this pigsty court and its ridiculous handwritten evidence says. This is the future, you old fool, and you cannot stop it." The room was stone. The ticking of the clock on the wall was suddenly deafeningly loud. Quentin Hargreave permitted himself a small, thin, very cold smile. "Thank you, Mr. Rourke, for entering your conspiracy to defraud the United States government and your intent to violate a federal injunction into the official record." Judge Thorne's face was purple. He slammed his open palm on the plank table. The sound was like a gunshot. "Silence. This hearing is concluded. This matter is now elevated. I am seizing all evidence presented. The site at Spring Knife Creek is hereby frozen, under the protection of this court and the United States Marshal's Office. Any man, from the railroad or otherwise, found at that site will be arrested. Mr. Rourke, your presence is required at the federal courthouse in Cheyenne in 1 week. You and your men will vacate that damn site within 12 hours. He locked eyes with the magistrate. "And Magistrate Fletch, your name has come up far too often. You will be joining Mr. Rourke in Cheyenne." It was over. Nora felt the strength go out of her legs, and she leaned back. Silas's hand found the small of her back, steadying her. "It's done," he murmured. They filed out. Nora, Silas, Eliza, and Samuel, into the sharp, blinding cold of the afternoon. The crowd from the hearing followed, spilling onto the boardwalk. Buzzing, Bristle, who had been tied to a post, bounded over, whining, sensing the tension. "Pike." The shout came from the narrow alley between the general store and the smithy. 3 men Nora had seen at the dam. Railroad toughs, their faces hard with anger and whiskey. They had just lost their payday. One of them, a big man with a red beard, held a pistol. He raised it, his eyes wild, pointing it not at Silas, but at Nora. She was the one. The cause. It happened outside of time. Nora saw the black hole of the muzzle. She heard Eliza scream. Silas did not hesitate. He did not draw his own weapon. He moved. In one brutal, shoving motion, he threw his entire body sideways, slamming into Nora, pushing her off the boardwalk and into the deep. Soft snowbank piled against the wall. He used his own body as a shield. The gun cracked. The sound was flat, ugly. Nora screamed as she fell. Silas grunted, a sharp, choked-off sound, as the bullet tore through the heavy muscle of his right shoulder. He stumbled but did not fall. He turned, his face a mask of such cold, absolute fury that the gunman took a step back, but he never got a second step. Bristle, a gray and black streak of rage, hit the man's arm. The dog's jaws locked, and the man screamed. A high, thin sound. As the pistol clattered onto the frozen mud of the street, the spell was broken. The men of Bitter Willow, the same men who had whispered, the ranchers and smiths and merchants, surged forward. The tide had turned. They swarmed the 3 railroad men, burying them in a wave of frontier justice. Nora scrambled out of the snow, her heart a frozen stone in her chest. "Silas!" He was standing, his left hand clamped tight over his right shoulder. Blood, dark and shockingly red, was already soaking the sleeve of his coat, dripping from his fingertips onto the white snow. He looked not at the brawl, not at his shoulder, but at her. His face was pale, tight with pain, but his eyes were clear. "Are you hurt?" Eliza and Samuel were at his side, Eliza already tearing a strip of cloth from her petticoat. The townspeople were dragging the gunman toward the marshal's office. Nora could only stare at the red stain spreading on the snow, and at the man who had, for the second time, placed himself between her and a cold, certain death. The whispers were gone. The balance of power in Bitter Willow had just been rewritten, not in a ledger, but in blood. Eliza Merriweather's parlor became a field hospital. The chaos of the street, the arrests, the cheering townsfolk, the shamefaced retreat of Rourke's lawyer was shut out, replaced by the sharp, metallic smell of blood, and the herbal tang of the antiseptic Samuel 2 Moons was boiling on the stove. Silas sat in a high-backed wooden chair, stripped to the waist, his face pale and filmed with sweat. The bullet had gone clean through the thick muscle of his shoulder. It was not a killing wound, but it was a maiming one. Samuel worked with a healer's economy, cleaning the entry and exit holes, his movements deft and sure. Nora held the basin. Her hands were steady, but her knuckles were white. She watched the water turn a deep, dark red. This was his blood, spilled for her. The thought was a cold, hard stone in her stomach. He had used his body as a shield. He had not hesitated. "He'll be weak," Samuel said, binding the shoulder with clean linen strips Eliza provided. "The fever will come tonight. He cannot ride. He cannot lift." Quentin Hargreaves stood by the window, his rifle in his hand, watching the street. "Rourke is still at the hotel. I've posted 2 men there, but he's not under arrest, not technically, not until the hearing in Cheyenne. He's free to go, and that's what worries me." As if summoned by his words, the weather turned. The brilliant, cold blue of the sky vanished, erased in less than 10 minutes by a low, fast-moving ceiling of bruised greenish-purple cloud. The wind, which had been still, returned with a low, rising moan. It was not over. The blizzard had not broken. It had only been circling. A new, finer snow began to fall, not drifting, but slashing sideways. A sudden, frantic pounding on Eliza's door made everyone jump. Hargreave had his pistol out before the door even flew open. It was a boy, maybe 15, breathless and coated in ice. It was young Tom, who delivered groceries for Otis Bell. Marshall, you gotta come, it's Rourke." "What about him?" Hargreave demanded. "He's gone. He and 2 of his hard cases. They just busted out of the hotel. They went to the saloon. Marshall, they grabbed Mr. Rusk." Nora felt the basin slip in her hands. "What? They took him?" the boy gasped, his chest heaving. "Mr. Rusk. He was in there, drinking, crying into his whiskey. Rourke and his men they grabbed him, threw him over a saddle like a sack of flour. He was yelling for you. Ma'am yelling for you to help him." Hargreave was already at the door. "Where did they go?" "North. They're riding for the canyon. I heard Rourke shouted at him. He said if he couldn't have the water, if he couldn't have his dam, then nobody would." The room went cold. It was a cold that had nothing to do with the wind. "The dynamite," Silas said, his voice a low, pained rumble. He was trying to stand, his good hand pushing against the arm of the chair. "He's going back. He's going to blow the springhead, bury it. And he has Jebediah," Hargreaves said, his face grim. "Leverage. He'll trade the man for your claim, Mrs. Rusk." "No," Nora said, her voice flat, the realization hitting her. "Not leverage. Bait. He wants us up there. He wants to finish it." "Eliza, stay here. Bar the door," Hargreave commanded. He looked at Samuel. "I need your rifle." "I am coming with you," Samuel said, gathering his bag of medicines. "Silas, you're staying," Nora said, turning to him. Silas was on his feet. He was swaying slightly, his face ashen, but his eyes were chips of blue ice. He looked at Nora, at the blood in the basin, at the snow slashing against the window. He said nothing. He just walked to the corner, picked up his heavy canvas coat, and began to shrugging it on with his one good arm, his jaw tight against the searing pain. "Silas, you can't," she pleaded. "You're hurt." "He's riding to my land," Silas said, his voice raw. "He's on my border. He has your husband, and he's going to destroy your water. This is not a discussion." The ride up the canyon was a journey into a screaming white hell. The new storm was worse than the first. A true, high-country blizzard that sought to strip the flesh from their bones. The wind was a physical force, a solid wall that shoved at them, trying to peel them from their saddles. They were 4 riders. Hargreave, the law, breaking the trail. Samuel, the tracker, his eyes squinted, reading the faint, already drifting tracks of Rourke's horses. Nora, her face covered, her father's map a hidden weight against her heart. And Silas, riding last. He was a statue of pain, his wounded arm held tight to his chest, his entire body rigid, moving with his horse as one solid frozen block. They heard the canyon before they saw it, and the sound was wrong. It was not just the roar of water, it was a high, thin, metallic scream. "The cables!" Hargreaves shouted back, his voice torn from his lips by the wind. "The damn cables!" They left the horses in a sheltered cleft of rock and crawled the last 100 yards. The scene below was not a construction site, it was an apocalypse. Rourke's Dam, wounded by the night's explosion and now assaulted by the renewed, ice-choked fury of the creek, was tearing itself apart. The water, a thick, raging torrent of brown slush and white ice, poured over the top, through the gaps, a monster fighting its cage. The main anchor cables, stretched from the beams to boulders on the canyon walls, were vibrating so fast they were a blur, the source of the terrible, high-pitched shriek. Ice was everywhere. Not snow, but pure, clear ice, coating every rock, every log, every surface, inches thick, and in the middle of it all, Thadley Rourke stood on the canyon rim, near the drill hole. Below him, on the central, groaning beam of the dam, was Jebediah. He was tied to the beam. Spread-eagled, the ice-cold water surged just feet beneath him. He was screaming, a high, thin, continuous sound of animal terror that was barely audible over the wind. Rourke saw them. He gave no sign of surprise. He calmly raised one hand. In it was a thick, red bundle of dynamite, a long, green fuse already dangling. He held it up for them to see. Then he pointed, a deliberate, theatrical gesture, down at Jebediah. The choice was clear. Her claim, or her husband. Hargreave raised his Winchester, trying to find a solid perch on the ice-covered rocks. Rourke, by the authority of the U.S. government, stand down. Rourke just laughed. The sound was ripped away, but they saw the shape of it. A shot was impossible. The wind was too strong, the target too small, and the man with the dynamite was too close to the edge. Jebediah saw her, his eyes, wide and white, locked on Nora. "Nora!" "Help me, Nora," Nora stood, the wind tearing at her, her hood blown back, her hair instantly matted with ice. She looked at the man who had left her to die in a snowdrift, the man who had called her an adulteress in open court to save himself, the man who had sold her, her land, and her father's memory for a new coat and $100. She felt a vast, cold, liberating nothing. This was justice. This was the wind, and the water, and the ice, and the rock, all working the will of the territory. He would be washed away, and she would be free. Silas, his breath coming in short, sharp grunts, was watching her. He did not speak. His face was a mask of agony, but his eyes were clear. He was waiting. This was her choice. No one else's. She hated Jebediah Rusk. She hated him with a clean, pure fire. But she would not let Thadley Rourke be her executioner. She would not let this man, with his Eastern suit and his cold, dead eyes, make her a party to a murder. She would not let him win. This was her water, her land, her life, and she would choose all of it. She locked eyes with Silas. She took a deep, searing breath of the icy air. "We save him." The words were spoken. The choice was made. Silas nodded once. "The cable, it's the only way." He pointed to the main anchor cable, the one screaming under the strain. "Samuel, Hargreave on the boulder brace at Nora, the coil." He unslung a coil of rope from his saddle, a thinner, stronger climbing rope. He tied it around his own waist with his one good hand. "He lit the fuse," Hargreave yelled, pointing, above them, on the ledge. Rourke had struck a match. The green fuse was sputtering, sparking. "Silas, no!" Nora screamed. "Your arm!" "Hold the rope," he commanded, his voice the old iron rumble. "Do not let go!" He handed her the end. She wrapped it twice around her waist, digging her heels into the icy rock, the rope burning her frozen hands. Silas clipped his belt to the vibrating guide cable. He swung out, his full weight on his one good arm, his feet dangling over the churning, ice-filled water. He was a pendulum, swinging in the heart of the storm. He hit the central beam, his boots skidding on the ice, Jebediah was hysterical, blubbering, trying to reach for him. "Shut up!" Silas roared. He pulled his knife and, bracing himself against the wind, began to saw at the thick ropes binding Jeb's wrists. Above, Rourke screamed in rage and dropped the sputtering bundle of dynamite, letting it slide down the rock face toward the dam. "Samuel the hook!" Silas yelled. Samuel, who had anticipated this, uncoiled his own rope, a heavy grappling hook at the end. He swung it, once, twice, and threw it with all his strength. The hook clattered and skipped on the ice-covered beam, then caught. "Jeb, hook on!" Silas shouted, slashing the last rope free. Jeb, his hands free but numb, fumbled for the hook, his fingers useless. Silas grabbed it and slammed it into the front of Jeb's belt. "Pull!" Hargreave and Samuel heaved, dragging Jebediah off the beam. He swung free, crashing into the rock wall and collapsing onto the bank like a landed fish. Silas, his work done, pushed off the beam, swinging back toward Nora. But Rourke was not finished. He was sliding down the rock face, his face a mask of pure madness, his knife in his hand. He was coming for Silas. The main anchor cable, the one they were all braced against, let out a sound like a cannon shot. The boulder it was tied to, undermined by the raging water, shifted, groaned, and then pulled free. The entire dam structure shuddered. The beam Silas had just left dropped 5 feet, smashing into the water. Silas, swinging free, was now a dead weight on Nora's rope. The force pulled her from her feet, dragging her, screaming, across the ice toward the edge. "Hold on!" Samuel yelled, lunging, grabbing the rope just behind her. Silas hit the canyon wall, hard, his wounded shoulder taking the impact. A sound, not a scream, but a deep, tearing grunt, was forced from his lungs. He dangled, 10 feet below them. Rourke, on his own ledge, saw his chance. He raised his knife. At the same instant, Rourke's own last, desperate act betrayed him. The sputtering bundle of dynamite, which had been sliding down the rock, finally hit the pool of slush and water at the dam's edge. There was a loud, wet, furious hiss, a puff of greasy white smoke. The fuse was dead. Rourke stared at it. His face, for 1 second, was a mask of utter, complete disbelief. And then the creek, in its final, glorious act of liberation, struck. The main beam, freed from its anchor, smashed by a log the size of a carriage, broke in two. The entire, illegal, brutal structure of Rourke's ambition collapsed. It did not just break. It disintegrated. A wall of black water, the imprisoned, pent-up heart of Spring Knife Creek, exploded outward. It was a cleansing, unstoppable force. It scoured the canyon clean. It ripped logs, rocks, and the last of the scaffolding away. It tore Thadley Rourke from his ledge as if he were a leaf, pulling him, his last scream unheard, into the churning, white and brown torrent. He vanished. The flood thundered past, a sound of pure, elemental freedom. And then, as quickly as it had come, it was gone. In the sudden, ringing silence, there was only the sound of the creek, now running fast and clear in its original, deep channel, and the wind, already beginning to soften. Jebediah was on his hands and knees, retching in the snow. Hargreave and Samuel were hauling, hand over hand, pulling Silas up over the lip of the canyon. He collapsed onto the ice, his face the color of the snow, unconscious. "Silas!" Nora crawled to him, her hands raw and bleeding from the rope. He was breathing. That was all. She turned. Jebediah was looking at her. His face was a ruin, a map of his own pathetic cowardice. He was shamed, broken, and alive. "Nora," he whispered, holding out a hand. I... She looked at the man she had married. She looked at the man lying unconscious at her feet. She looked at the creek, running free. "I choose life," Nora said, her voice quiet, but hard as the ice beneath her knees. "Not you." She turned her back on her husband. She and Samuel lifted Silas, his good arm over Samuel's shoulder, his wounded one over hers. As they stood, the four of them, The living! The sky above them tore open. The bruised, purple clouds were ripped apart, and to the east, a single, brilliant shaft of light broke through, painting the horizon a deep, impossible, rosy pink. It was a line of silk, a fire on the edge of the world. The storm was over. The final hearing was a formality, a quiet amen to a war that had already been won. They did not meet in the drafty hall, but in the small, warm office of Judge Thorne, who had extended his circuit stay. Thadley Rourke's body had been found 5 miles downstream, his fine city coat tangled in a snag of willow roots. His company's lawyers, dispatched from Cheyenne, were pale, apologetic, and utterly defeated. Their claims were declared null and void, tainted by criminal conspiracy, illegal action, and, as Judge Thorne dryly noted, an overwhelming act of God. Amos Fletch was there, but not as magistrate. He was a small, sweating man in a rumpled shirt. Marshal Hargreave stood beside him, his hand resting on a stack of federal indictments for fraud, conspiracy, and conflict of interest. Fletch's room was quiet, total, and permanent. Jebediah Rusk sat alone in the back, near the door. He was no longer the peacock in the new coat. He was just a man, hollowed out, his eyes empty. Judge Thorne turned to Nora. "Mrs. Rusk, or is it Vale?" "It's Vale, Your Honor," Nora said, her voice clear. "Miss Vale, then." The judge pushed a stack of papers across his desk. Her father's incomplete homestead certificate, now countersigned by Marshal Hargreave and himself. Your father's logs, the testimony of Mr. Two Moons and Mrs. Merriweather, and your own bravery at the dam site have more than satisfied the beneficial use and intent requirements of the Homestead Act. The water and the land to which it is appended are yours, wholly and without question. He gestured to the last page. The final filing. Your signature is all that is required. He handed her the pen. Silas stood behind her, his right arm in a clean linen sling, his left hand resting on the back of her chair. He was her silent, solid shadow. Nora took the pen. The ink was black, the paper thick. She looked at the line, which read, "Homesteader's legal signature." She dipped the pen. She did not write Nora Rusk. She did not write Nora Vale Rusk. She wrote, in a clear, strong hand, Nora Vale, a name, whole and sufficient on its own. She signed her freedom. Judge Thorne nodded once. Taking the paper, he looked at Jebediah. "Mr. Rusk, your actions have been deemed an act of spousal abandonment, criminal negligence, and collusion. You are hereby ordered to vacate this county within 24 hours. Your presence is no longer welcome in this territory." Jeb stood. He did not look at Nora. He did not look at Silas. He just turned, his boots no longer squeaking, and walked out the door, a ghost disappearing into the bright, cold sunlight. A week later, the thaw had truly begun. The air was still cold, but it smelled of damp earth and possibility. The great oppressive drifts were shrinking, and the sound of running water was everywhere. Nora and Silas stood on the bank of Spring Knife Creek. It was a different creature now. It was not the choked, sullen pool Rourke had made, nor the vengeful torrent that had cleansed the canyon. It was a happy, clear, swift-moving stream, chuckling over the rocks, its voice the sound of life itself. The scar of the dam was already being softened, the mud banks settling, the water finding its true, old path. Silas was quiet. He had been quiet for days, healing. The wound was deep, the fever had been high, but he had fought it with the same stubborn endurance he applied to everything. He looked at the water, his face thoughtful. He reached into the pocket of his good coat with his left hand. "I found this," he said. He held it out to her. It was a piece of metal, dark, no longer rusted, but pitted and scarred. It was the nail from the eaves of the general store, the one that had made the tack sound, the omen of the breaking. He had taken it to the smithy with his one good arm. He had worked the bellows and the hammer, heating and bending the old, discarded piece of iron. He had forged it. He had twisted the head into a simple, elegant loop, and bent the shaft into a strong, graceful hook. "It's a peg," he said, his voice a low rumble. "For the cabin, to hang things on." She took it. It was still warm from his hand, heavy and real, a symbol of a new beginning, forged from the rusted-out past. She looked at him, and her heart was so full it ached. He was wearing his gloves, his armor, his thick, mule-hide shells that kept the world at bay. He watched her, his gaze steady. He had given her the hook. Now, he would give her the choice. "Nora," he said, his voice rough, "this land is yours. The water is yours. You are your own." He paused, and the only sound was the rush of the creek. "But if you want," he said, his voice dropping, "we could hold this water together. We could hold each other." He stood, waiting, his declaration made. He had offered his partnership, and then he did the one thing that was his alone to give. With his left hand, he reached over, grasped the fingers of his right-hand glove, and slowly, deliberately, pulled it from his wounded arm, wincing as the wool passed over the new, tender scars. He then reached, with his good left hand, and stripped the glove from it as well. He stood barehanded in the cold, bright air, his hands chapped, scarred, and vulnerable. He held his left hand out to her, the hand that was strong, the hand that had carved the new claim, the hand that had held her in the night. He had given her his bare hand in the storm, to give her life. He had touched her with his bare hand in the cabin, to give her comfort. Now, he offered her his bare hand in the sunlight, to offer her his entire world. Nora looked at his hand, then at his face. She saw the lines of pain, the deep, abiding loneliness that was now, finally, receding. She saw the man who had been a wall, and then an anchor, and was now, simply, a home. She did not take his hand. She stepped forward, inside his reach. She let the forged hook drop from her fingers, letting it hang from its leather thong on her wrist. She raised her own bare hand, not to his, but to his chest. She laid her palm flat against the rough wool, directly over his heart. She felt it. Thump, thump. It was not the frantic, ticking panic of the watch. It was not the hammering, adrenaline-fueled beat of the man in the canyon. It was a new rhythm. It was slow and steady and infinitely strong. It was a beat as calm, as deep, and as reliable as the creek flowing at their feet. She smiled. He closed his eyes, his breath coming out in a long, shaky sigh, as if a great weight had finally been set down. He covered her hand with his own, pressing it to his chest, and leaned his forehead against hers. They were not alone. Down by the old knife marker, a small group was gathered. Samuel Two Moons was there, and Eliza Merriweather, holding her ledger. Marshal Hargreave, his work done, sat on his horse, a satisfied witness. And two other ranchers, men who had been at the hearing, men who had seen the shooting, had come. They were driving new posts, not of a dam, but of a boundary. Samuel and Eliza were helping them draft a new document, a community accord, based on Thomas Vale's old logs. It was a shared set of rules. First appropriation, beneficial use, no waste. The water would be shared, protected. The days of the land grab were over. Bristle, the gray dog, free of the tension, was ecstatic. He ran in wide, happy circles, barking at the running water. He found a piece of dark, splintered wood, a remnant of Rourke's ruined dam washed up on the bank. He snatched it, tossed it in the air, and began to chew on it, his tail wagging, turning the past into a game. Eliza had brought a spool of blue ribbon. She tied a length of it to the drooping branch of a willow, just at the water's line. The blue strip fluttered in the clean, cold wind. It was a promise. Clean water, clear hearts, the sun, dropping toward the western peaks, hit the fast-moving surface of Spring Knife Creek. The light shattered, refracting, turning the ripples into 1,000, dancing, moving coins of pure gold. Nora and Silas stood, his arm, the good one, wrapped around her, her head resting on his uninjured shoulder. They watched the light on the water, It was the real treasure, the true currency, the wealth that Jebediah and Rourke, in their blindness, had never been able to see. It was life, and it was theirs. The winter of 1886, the great die-up did not just end, it broke. It shattered like a sheet of black ice under a hammer, and the sound of its breaking was the sound of running water. Spring came to the high country not as a gentle guest, but as a violent, sudden thaw. The snowpack, which had buried the territory in a frozen white silence, dissolved in a matter of days. The valleys of bitter willow, which had been graves, became riverbeds. The roar of the unlocked creeks was the first sound anyone had heard in months that was not the wind. At the ranch on Spring Knife Creek, the change was a resurrection. The land, scoured and scrubbed by the ice, came back with a desperate, hungry green. Indian paintbrush and wild lupine exploded in shades of red and blue along the banks where Rourke's dam had been. The water, running clean and fast in its true channel, was the loudest thing in the valley. A constant, happy shout of liberation. Silas's shoulder healed. It was a slow, scarred process, but the strength returned to his arm, and with it, he began to build. The cabin at Pike's Cut, his bachelor's fortress, was no longer sufficient. He was adding a room, cutting new, wider windows to let in the light. Nora, too, was building. She did not need the new room to begin. On the porch, in the warm, pine-scented air of late spring, she opened a school. It was not a formal affair. It was 2 benches, a slate, and a piece of chalk. The children of the few homesteaders who had survived the winter, their families bound to the new community water accord, sat shoulder to shoulder with the children of Samuel Two Moons' people. They were a mix of shy, dark-eyed faces and freckled, boisterous ones. Nora, her dress protected by a flour sack apron, moved between them, teaching them their letters, teaching them sums, teaching them the one simple, unspoken lesson that they were all, now, neighbors. The past was not forgotten. It was enshrined. One evening, Silas brought her father's map to her, the original calfskin, still faintly creased from where she had hidden it. He had spent a week building a frame, using the last of the good, clear pine from his stores. Together, by the light of the lamp, they set it. Nora cleaned the map, her fingers tracing the faded blue line of the creek, the spidery notations of her father's hand. They placed it under a sheet of glass Silas had hauled from Cheyenne. They hung it, not in the new room, not in the stable, but over the hearth, the center of the home. It was no longer a hidden deed, a secret of a coming fight. It was their founding document. It was a testament, a covenant with the land, a guide that showed where the life came from. In this house, it was the first and most holy of scriptures. Silas had salvaged the wood. He had ridden up the canyon and, with his one good arm, had wrestled the splintered, waterlogged beams of Rourke's ruined dam from the mud. He had dragged them, one by one, back to the ranch. He spent weeks with a saw and a plane, his healed shoulders straining, his face set in concentration, milling the wood, cutting away the rot, finding the hardwood. From the timber of their oppression, he built their future. He built a table. It was massive, long and wide and thick, big enough to seat a dozen. It dominated the main room, a solid, unmovable testament to permanence. He had planed it smooth, rubbing it with beeswax until it glowed with a low, deep light. Nora would run her hands over it in the quiet of the morning. The grain of the wood, stained dark by its time under the flood, swirled and eddied in patterns like a captive river. Under her palm, the liberated water, now held in smooth, warm, domestic wood, was finally at peace. One evening, as the long, high-country twilight painted the sky in shades of violet and rose, they walked down to the creek. The sound of the water was a constant comfort. He had built a new, small dock, a simple plank structure that jutted out over the fast-moving current. They stood on it, the cool, damp air rising to meet them, smelling of willow and pine. Silas had been mending the north fence line, the one shattered by the blizzard. He wore his heavy coat, and his hands, as always, were covered. His work gloves, the thick mule-hide armor, were dark with sweat and leather oil. He stood beside her, watching the water, watching the first stars appear in the darkening blue. He had been quiet all day, the way he was when he was thinking, a deep, internal quiet. Then he turned to her. It had become their ritual, a small, profound ceremony that belonged only to them. He looked at her, his eyes clear and calm in the dusk. Slowly, deliberately, he stripped the heavy glove from his right hand. He did the same with his left. It was not the desperate pain gesture of the storm, nor the hesitant, confessional uncovering in the cabin. This was the easy, familiar motion of a man coming home. He tucked the gloves into the deep pocket of his coat. He offered her his bare hand. Nora smiled. She took it, her hand, no longer trembling, no longer raw from the rope. Settled into his palm was calloused, scarred, and warm. Their fingers laced together. A perfect, broken fit. They stood, silent, hand in hand, two solitary figures who were no longer alone. He leaned in. He did not ask. He did not need to. The kiss was as quiet and as deep as the creek itself. It tasted of the cool evening air, of pine, and of a profound, unshakable peace. It was a kiss that asked for nothing and offered everything. It was a promise, kept and renewed, a punctuation mark at the end of a long day. When they parted, they did not speak. They did not need to. They looked at each other, their eyes reflecting the last light of the sky, and in them was the one word that defined their entire world. Home, later, in the stable. The animals were quiet. The big roan, the horse that had carried them both through the storm, huffed softly in his stall. The air was warm and sweet with hay. Nora picked up Silas's heavy work knife from the bench. He leaned against the stall, his sling long gone, his shoulders solid and strong beneath his shirt, and watched her. She moved to the main crossbeam, the heavy lintel of the stable door, worn smooth by years of his hand brushing against it. She found a clear space, and with a steady, determined hand, she began to carve. The knife bit deep. The wood was old, seasoned pine. She carved the letters, not small, but clear and deep, where the sun would catch them in the morning. N-V-S-C, not Rusk, not Pike, Vale, and Calder, a partnership, and beneath the initials, she carved the motto of their house, the blessing and the law that had brought them together. Let the water run. The next morning, Marshal Hargreaves sat on his horse, his saddlebags packed. His work in Bitter Willow was finished. Fletch was in a federal jail in Cheyenne. The community water accord was filed with the territorial court, a model of frontier justice. He tipped his hat to Nora, who stood on the porch, and to Silas, who stood beside her. Miss Vale, Mr. Pike. He gave them a rare, thin smile. It seems this valley has found its balance. My work here is done. He looked around at the greening hills, at the clear, flowing water. It seems when justice starts to flow properly, I have less to do. He turned his horse and rode south, a solitary figure of a law that was no longer needed. As he disappeared over the ridge, a sound, clear and bright, rolled across the valley. From Bitter Willow, the sound of Eliza Merriweather's church bell. It was not the frantic, relentless alarm of the night of the explosion. It was the steady, even peaceful ring of a Sunday morning, a call to worship, a sound of a community, whole and at peace. That evening, they stood by the cabin door, the new, larger door he had built, in his hand. Silas held the hook he had forged from the rusty nail, and in his other, his old pair of work gloves, the ones he had worn in the storm, now worn thin. The leather cracked. He drove the hook deep into the wooden door frame, the iron ringing against the log. He took the gloves, he hung them, crossed, on the hook. They hung there, by the entrance to their home, the armor, the shield, the old, discarded defense of a lonely man. They hung next to the hook, the omen of the breaking. They were a monument, a memory, a permanent, quiet reminder of the day a man, faced with a woman freezing in the snow, took off his gloves and said, "I won't let you sleep here." The view, the imaginary camera, pulls back. It leaves the two figures in the doorway, leaves the small, warm light of the cabin. It rises up over the stable, over the new green fields. It rises higher, seeing the silver, winding thread of Spring Knife Creek. Now running free, Bitter Willow is a small cluster of distant lights in the vast, gathering twilight. The plains stretch out, an endless dark ocean of land, immense, empty, and wild. But the cabin on Spring Knife Creek, the small house with the map above its hearth, the table at its center, and the gloves by its door, is not small. It is one window, one light, one thin plume of smoke rising straight into the calm evening air. It is a fire, a steady, stubborn, and persistent flame, burning brightly in the heart of the great, empty, beautiful dark. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and give it an extra boost by hitting the hype button so more people can hear this tale.